Eleanor Whitmore, a 74-year-old woman from Charleston, South Carolina. She's wealthy, elegant, and has spent decades building a life most could only dream of. But life hasn't been kind lately. She's battling cancer, and time feels like it's slipping away. And then, out of nowhere, she meets him. Marcus Hayes, a 21-year-old with a charming smile and a way with words that could melt even the coldest heart. He's new in town, full of ambition, and seems captivated by Eleanor's wisdom and grace. Their connection? Instant. Their love story? Unbelievable. The people of Charleston couldn't stop talking. Why would a young man like Marcus marry a woman old enough to be his grandmother? But Eleanor didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive. She believed Marcus when he said age was just a number and that he loved her for the woman she was. The romance moved fast. Within months, Marcus proposed under the warm glow of a Charleston sunset, and Eleanor said yes, tears streaming down her face. They exchanged vows in an intimate ceremony, with only a handful of close friends and family to witness their love. But not everyone was convinced. Is this true love? Or does Marcus have other plans? Here's the question I want you to keep in mind: why would a 21-year-old man marry a 74-year-old woman? Is it really love? Or is there something lurking beneath the surface? Stick around as we peel back the layers of this whirlwind romance. By the end of this video, you'll see just how far someone can go when the stakes are life-changing, and when they think no one's watching. Don't miss a second of this story. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. Trust me, you won't believe where this goes. Eleanor Whitmore had always been a fighter. When the doctors told her she had terminal cancer, she took it with grace, the kind only a woman of her strength could muster. She told Marcus, her new husband, that she wasn't afraid of death. She'd lived a full life and was ready for whatever came next. But Marcus? Marcus had a different reaction. At first, he played the role of the devoted husband perfectly. He held her hand during treatments, whispered words of comfort, and promised to stay by her side until the very end. To Eleanor, he was a blessing. But in his mind? He was counting down the days. You see, Eleanor's wealth wasn't just a number on a bank statement, it was freedom. It was power. And for Marcus, it was the answer to a life he had always dreamed of but could never achieve on his own. He thought the cancer would take her quickly, that he'd soon inherit everything and start a life most 21-year-olds couldn't even imagine. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Eleanor didn't just survive, she fought back. She hired the best doctors, underwent cutting-edge treatments, and somehow, against all odds, started to get better. For most husbands, this would have been a miracle. But for Marcus? It was a nightmare. Late at night, when Eleanor was asleep, Marcus would sit in their grand living room, staring at her will. He knew every word by heart. Everything would go to him. All he had to do was wait. But how much longer could he pretend? How much longer could he play the role of a loving husband while resentment and greed bubbled beneath the surface? Eleanor would smile at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, and he'd smile back, but his thoughts told a different story. He wasn't just her husband anymore, he was her heir. And the longer she lived, the further away his dreams seemed. The question wasn't if Marcus would get what he wanted. It was how far he'd go to make sure he did. Stick with me, because what happens next will leave you asking, how much is too much to risk for money? And when does ambition become something much darker? Eleanor Whitmore was supposed to be dying. That's what the doctors had said. That's what Marcus had been counting on. But Eleanor? She had other plans. Her cancer treatments were brutal, weeks of chemotherapy, endless doctor visits, and a body that seemed to be failing her more every day. Yet, somehow, she fought back. The best doctors in Charleston worked tirelessly, leaving no stone unturned. Money was never an issue, and Eleanor made sure of that. State-of-the-art treatments, experimental drugs, round-the-clock care, whatever it took to beat the odds. And slowly, miraculously, she began to recover. Her color returned. Her strength grew. Soon, she was smiling more, laughing again, and even talking about taking a vacation once she was strong enough. The woman who had once been told she wouldn't live to see another Christmas was now planning for spring. For her, it was a miracle. For Marcus, it was a disaster. Each sign of her recovery felt like a slap in the face. He couldn't believe it. How could she be getting better? He had already envisioned the life he'd have, her estate, her fortune, all of it in his hands. But now? It felt like the finish line was moving further and further away. Every dinner, every conversation, every smile she gave him became unbearable. When she talked about the future, it made him sick. He'd nod and smile, pretending to be the supportive husband, but inside, his frustration was boiling over. Marcus started avoiding her. He'd stay out late, make excuses to leave the house, and when they were together, he barely spoke. Eleanor thought he was just tired, maybe overwhelmed by everything they'd been through. She had no idea what was really going on in his mind. He didn't see a wife anymore, he saw an obstacle. An obstacle standing between him and the life he believed he deserved. But what do you do when the victim refuses to die? How far would someone go to rewrite a plan that's falling apart? Stay with me, because Marcus is about to answer that question in a way that will leave you stunned. Marcus Hayes was a man running out of patience. Eleanor's recovery wasn't just unexpected, it was infuriating. The future he had so carefully planned was slipping further and further away. And as the days turned into weeks, hope gave way to something much darker. Marcus began to change. The charm that once made him so likable was gone. He stopped pretending to care, stopped playing the role of a doting husband. Instead, he spent his time alone, pacing the halls of Eleanor's grand home, his mind consumed with one thought: how do I make this end? He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't watch her grow stronger, watch her talk about the future he didn't want her to have. And so, he made a decision: if nature wouldn't take its course, he would force it. It started small. Research. Late at night, when Eleanor was asleep, Marcus would sit in front of his laptop, looking up ways to make someone's death look natural. Poison? A staged accident? He read everything he could, his heart pounding with every click. And then, one night, he settled on a plan. It was simple, he thought. He'd crush up a lethal dose of Eleanor's medication, slip it into her evening tea, and let her body do the rest. She'd go quietly, peacefully. No one would suspect a thing. At least, that's what he told himself. The night he chose was quiet. The house was still, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the air conditioning. Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book she loved. Marcus watched her from the kitchen, the cup of tea in his hand trembling slightly. Just do it, he thought. She'll never know. He walked over to her, his face a mask of calm. Here you go, he said, handing her the cup. Eleanor smiled at him, that same smile that once made him feel like a hero. She took the tea, thanked him, and sipped it slowly, unaware of what he had done. But as the minutes passed, Marcus felt something he didn't expect. Panic. Watching her, waiting for something to happen, he realized just how far he'd gone. He wasn't just a greedy husband anymore, he was a man crossing a line he could never come back from. And in that moment, as Eleanor set the empty cup down, Marcus's heart raced. Had it worked? Or had he just sealed his own fate? Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the unraveling of this case will keep you on the edge of your seat. What happens next will shock you. The morning started like any other in Eleanor Whitmore's grand Charleston home. The sun streamed through the windows, and the world outside carried on, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded inside. But in the quiet of her bedroom, Eleanor lay still. Her lifeless body was discovered by the housekeeper, who immediately let out a scream that echoed through the halls. Marcus rushed in, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "Eleanor!" he cried, dropping to his knees beside her. He clutched her hand, shaking it gently as if trying to wake her. To anyone watching, he looked like a heartbroken husband, shattered by the sudden loss of the woman he loved. But inside? Inside, he was already rehearsing the story he'd tell. "She must have passed in her sleep," he'd say, his voice trembling just enough to sell the lie. The house quickly filled with chaos. Paramedics arrived, followed by police, who had questions Marcus wasn't quite ready to answer. As neighbors gathered outside, whispering about the tragedy, Marcus put on the performance of his life. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking, his face buried in his hands. Eleanor's friends and family were devastated. Many of them hadn't even seen her since her recovery began. To them, she was a fighter, someone who had overcome so much, only to be taken too soon. One of her closest friends, Margaret, was inconsolable. "She was doing so well," she said through tears. "I just don't understand how this could happen." And that's the thing, none of them understood. None of them knew what really happened behind closed doors. For Marcus, the weight of their grief was suffocating, but he told himself it would all be worth it. The fortune he had dreamed of was finally within reach. All he had to do was keep up the act. But here's the thing about guilt, it has a way of showing itself, no matter how hard you try to hide it. As the police began their investigation, as questions were asked and evidence was gathered, cracks began to form in Marcus's story. And soon, the truth would come to light. Stay with me, because this crime isn't as perfect as Marcus thought it was. Every lie has a breaking point. And for Marcus Hayes, that moment came faster than he ever expected. After Eleanor's death, the investigators wasted no time. They went through every inch of the house, every room, every corner. At first, Marcus stood by, watching from the sidelines, keeping up his act of a grieving husband. But as the days went by, something started to shift. The detectives weren't buying his story. It started with the little things, the inconsistencies in his timeline. He had said he'd been with Eleanor the night she died, but his phone records told a different story. A few hours before her death, he had been seen leaving a local pharmacy. Why would he need medicine for his wife, who already had a prescription? It didn't add up. Then came the autopsy report. The cause of death? Not what anyone expected. There were no signs of natural causes. In fact, the medical examiner found traces of a substance in Eleanor's system, something that wasn't prescribed. It wasn't lethal on its own, but combined with the right conditions, it could be. The investigators were closing in. Marcus was becoming the prime suspect, and he knew it. The night of his arrest, the weight of his lies finally started to sink in. He had been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. But now, as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he couldn't help but feel a chill run through him. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. In the interrogation room, he tried to maintain his composure. But inside, his mind was racing. The detective's questions were sharp, direct, and relentless. "Where were you the night she died, Marcus?" the detective asked. "I told you, I was with her," Marcus replied, his voice wavering just a bit. But the detective didn't back down. He placed the evidence on the table, piece by piece, the phone records, the pharmacy receipt, the autopsy results. With each piece, Marcus's resolve began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat building on his forehead. His mind raced for an excuse, a way out. But there was nothing left. The lies he had told were unraveling, and there was no way to stitch them back together. Finally, it all came out. In a moment of weakness, Marcus admitted what he had done. The plan. The poison. The hope that Eleanor's death would set him free. But freedom wasn't what he'd find. Stay with me, because now the question is, will Marcus pay the price for his actions, or will he find a way to escape justice? Did Marcus really think he'd get away with it? The lies, the manipulation, the cold-hearted murder of the woman who had once loved him? When the courtroom doors slammed shut behind him, it was clear that this was no longer just about Eleanor's death, it was about making sure Marcus paid for what he had done. The trial was a spectacle. Packed with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. On one side, the prosecution presented their case, every shred of evidence, every piece of the puzzle, pieced together to show exactly what Marcus had done. They spoke of his greed, his patience, and his brutal final act that ended Eleanor's life. On the other side, Marcus sat. His face was ashen, his eyes cold. He had no real defense. His lawyer tried to argue for leniency, claiming that he'd been under immense stress, but everyone knew the truth. The truth was there for all to see. The prosecution laid out everything, the phone records, the pharmacy receipt, the poison found in Eleanor's system. And then, there was his confession. The confession that sealed his fate. As the witnesses testified, the room fell into a heavy silence. Eleanor's friends, her family, they spoke of her kindness, her strength, and her hope. They described the woman Marcus had promised to love, the woman he had taken everything from. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. She trusted him, she said, fighting back tears. She thought she was safe with him. And then came the moment the world had been waiting for, the verdict. The judge stood, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Marcus had watched, silent and still, his fate about to be sealed. We find the defendant, Marcus Hayes, guilty of murder in the first degree, the judge announced, his voice firm and unwavering. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the verdict hanging in the air. Marcus's face remained unreadable. But inside, his heart was pounding. The reality was settling in. There was no escape. He had crossed a line, and now, there would be consequences. As he was led away in handcuffs, the mixed feelings in the room were palpable. Some were relieved, others sad for the life that had been lost and the woman who would never get the chance to see justice served in a way she deserved. Eleanor may have been gone, but at least now, Marcus would pay for what he had done. Justice had been served. But was it enough to make up for the years she lost, for the trust that was shattered? Only time would tell. Stay tuned, because in the end, sometimes justice isn't just about a verdict, it's about the price of a life. This story isn't just about greed, it's about something much deeper. It's about the value of life and love, and how quickly both can be lost when one person lets their hunger for money cloud their judgment. Marcus Hayes was willing to sacrifice everything, his wife, her trust, their future, for the promise of wealth. But in the end, what did he really gain? A life behind bars and the loss of everything that truly mattered. Eleanor's death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of a dream, a future that could have been filled with love, laughter, and genuine connection. Her tragic end reminds us all that no amount of money can replace the people we love. So, think about it, what would you do for money? How far would you go, and at what cost? The real question here is wealth worth more than the love we share with those who matter most? If this story made you think, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the true value of life.